I'm going to try and get through this last bit relatively quickly so I can leave a little bit of time for people to ask questions if people have any questions from the semester before you guys have the midterm on Monday. You have midterm Monday. I'll lecture again on Wednesday, wrapping up the first half of the semester, or lecture for which you need to prepare nothing. How nice for you. So leading into, and then you guys have section at the end of next week and then the week off before we get into the second half of class. One more plea. If I have not heard from you either at the beginning of the semester or recently about accommodations for exam, please get in touch with me. I have heard from some of you, but I want to make sure everybody who needs or wants accommodations receives them. I can only do that if you let me know, so please email me if I haven't heard from you yet. Okay, that's all. So last class, we talked about what is important for Deuteronomy in terms of the laws themselves, right? We looked at the content, and this time I want to talk about the broader picture, that is Deuteronomy's broader concept of history. Specifically, how history and law are worked together into a complete whole. And in order to understand what D is doing, we have to ask, where is D getting all of this narrative from, right? As you read, and it keeps on retelling all this stuff that happened. And the first clue comes pretty early on. The Lord God spoke to us at Horeb. As you may remember from previously in the semester, the name of the mountain is something of a sticking point for the pedagogical sources. J and P call it Sinai. E calls it Horeb. So this is a pretty good clue right away as to where D is getting its story from. There's plenty more, however. The appointing of judges, right in Deuteronomy 1, has recognizable everything, words and content. This one's going to be longer, but you will see, again, the battle against Og in Deuteronomy 3 is nearly verbatim, Numbers 21. Look at what God says to Moses in the golden calf episode in Deuteronomy 9. Right. And notice, there's a golden calf in Deuteronomy, and there's tablets, and there's Decalogue, right? Again, these are all elements that come exclusively from E. Crucially, this is my favorite. Not only is this my favorite, this is the text upon which I gave my job talk for this job, so I am very fond of it. And so you get one slide. Look at the making of the second set of the tablets in Deuteronomy 10, right? It is in Deuteronomy 10, it's a perfectly coherent story, right? But look at and you can see the almost verbatim parallel story over there from E, but look at the verse numbers from E, from Exodus 34. It's not a continuous story there, right? It's like a smattering of verses from the beginning and then one from the end. So that means what I have here is I have D, the Deuteronomic text, following an E text that is, in our canonical Bible, interwoven with J, but D is presenting it to us. So either D was a terrific source critic and was like, I can find the E parts in this chapter and I'll pick them out, or, as seems almost certain, this is evidence that D was reading the independent E text, right, before it was combined with J, right, such that it could be followed note for note. This is obviously not only of interest for those of us who care about where D is getting its ideas and its content from, but also this is a pretty good proof of the existence of E, right? Pretty good proof. This is only, what I'm giving you here is only a small part of all of the evidence. There's plenty. So one may ask, does D know only E, right? Does D have the E document in front of it, and that's what's following along? And the answer is not quite. The story of the spies in Deuteronomy 1 comes from J. J tells, and I should add, the spy story in Numbers 13:14 is itself a composite of J and P, and here again, Deuteronomy just follows J as if it had extracted it, in fact, demonstrating that D was reading J prior to its combination with P. So D knew E and D knew J, but D knew them as separate documents. So why then does D follow basically only E for the vast majority of the narrative, especially at Horeb? And to answer this, we have to think about what it is that D is. Right? And D is a covenant, right? As we talked about last time. It presents itself as covenant. A new covenant, right? A covenant that builds on the covenant that was made back at Horeb at the beginning of the wilderness journey. And which source has law-giving and covenant at Horeb? That's E. So in other words, E has the structure and the form and the content that D is is interested in. But D doesn't simply copy its sources, E or J. D, of course, has its own aims, its own arguments, its own style, and makes some adjustments here and there to its source material. For example, and this is a big one, in D, Moses takes credit for things that in E, Moses didn't do. For example, in D, it's Moses who has the idea of choosing judges from among the Israelites. In E, that's Jethro, right, his father-in-law, who appears nowhere in D's telling of this event. Right, Jethro has been excised from the story, and Moses has taken his role. In the spy story, in J, Caleb says, "Come on, everybody, don't be afraid. We'll all go up and overcome it." And Moses, when he retells this in Deuteronomy, is like, "I said to you," and Caleb gets eviscerated from the text. In D, Moses intercedes on Aaron's behalf after the golden calf. Like, God was so angry with Aaron that he would have destroyed him, and Moses intercedes and spares Aaron. And in E, that simply never happens. You may recall in E, Moses is like, "That's cool, Aaron, whatever." So you can see in these how D is reading, at times almost correcting its source material, correcting E. So D takes and adapts E's and J's narratives from Horeb through the wilderness. But more than that, certainly more importantly, in many senses, D also takes over E's law code, right, the covenant code, and reworks those laws. Virtually every single law in the covenant code is restated in Deuteronomy. Some of them nearly verbatim. That's one that happens to be verbatim. Some of them with some alterations. Right, Exodus 21 says, "I'm going to assign you a place to flee for those who have committed manslaughter," and Deuteronomy restates that, but with in a slightly different words. And of course, D adds laws to its law code that are nowhere found in the covenant code at all. I just picked this one because it's one of my favorite little semi-insults in the Bible. Right, he will go by the name of the family of the unsandaled one, which is, of course, nowhere to be found in the covenant code. So D is consciously rewriting E, not just its narrative, but also, importantly, its laws. But more than that, D isn't supplementing. D is written to be a replacement for. You cannot read, I realize we do now, but you really can't read both E and D together as a single continuous narrative. Not just because the laws are repetitive and sometimes contradictory, but because D goes out of its way to refute some of E's central claims. Think about the one gigantic difference in the stories. Is that in E, God proclaims the Ten Commandments, and the people say they'll obey the laws to come, and God gives Moses the laws privately up on the mountain, and then Moses immediately gives them to the Israelites, right, who ratify them in this covenant ceremony, which is why we call it the covenant code, where he throws blood on them. The whole, right, that's the whole thing that happens in E. In D, God proclaims the Ten Commandments. The people say they'll obey the laws to come. God gives Moses the laws privately, and then, as I said last time, Moses puts them in his pocket and holds on to them for the next 40 years. Right, until the Israelites reach the border of Canaan, at which point they make a new covenant. Right. So in E, the covenant at Horeb is based on the laws of the covenant code, hence its name, whereas in D, the covenant at Horeb is based on the Ten Commandments, and the covenant based on the law code is a 40 years later deal. This is like a super major change, right? D has, in doing this, essentially said the covenant code never happened, right? That didn't happen. The laws that God gave Moses back at the mountain are these laws, not those laws. And D is clear about it, right? He declared to you the covenant he commanded you observe, that is the 10 Commandments, and inscribed them. And at that time, he commanded me to impart to you laws and rules for you to observe in the land that you are to cross into and occupy, right? So even here, like thinking about these laws are for not now, that is now being at Horev, but for later when you're going to enter the land. Deuteronomy says, the Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horev, right? And that covenant is, I and the Lord am your God, and it's the 10 Commandments. And after the 10 Commandments, again, we see, you remain here with me, and I'll give you the whole instruction, the laws and the rules that you will impart to them for them to observe in the land that I'm giving them to possess. Upon which Moses says, and this, what's about to come out of my mouth, is the instruction that the Lord your God commanded me to impart to you. Right? It's not something else that we said before. It's this that I'm about to say to you now. That's what I was told then. Right? This is what I was told then. There is no, as I said, there's no mention of the covenant ceremony in Exodus 24, right, the blood throwing stuff. Basically, D skips over the entire giving of the covenant code and everything related to it, which makes sense since D is saying it never happened. So even as D is quoting from E, following its story, adapting its laws, it is also saying, it is also replacing E. Right? It's replacing it as a text. And again, we can see why. E has all the features that D wants. It has an initial covenant. It has laws. It has concerns about prophecy. But D reshapes the E narrative to fit its particular viewpoint. Right? In particular, D's laws are all given looking forward, right? For them to observe in the land that I am giving them to possess. Not now in this story, but once they've crossed the Jordan. Right? So it makes sense that D's laws should be given at the border, right? Not 40 years earlier. Right? What do they need? What do they need laws for when they enter Canaan for 40 years ago? D is very clear. Its laws are for across the border, after the Exodus generation has all died. Okay, so we've seen how D uses E's material as the backbone of its narrative, right? It follows, and again, you could see this in greater detail if you were to track it down yourself, but all the Horev material and a lot of the material in the first few chapters, very much all built on E, and certainly all the laws. What about the way that D uses J? As I said, he knows them separately and uses them differently. It's actually through the lens of J that we maybe get a better glance at D's historical concerns. The most substantial story that D takes from J, in fact, the only substantial story that D takes from J, is the story of the spies. But D makes passing reference to other J narratives. In this one little verse in Deuteronomy 9:22, in the midst of talking about how disobedient the Israelites are, Moses sort of tosses off, remember, you guys pissed off God at Tavera and Massa and Kivrot Ta'ava. And somebody not familiar, deeply familiar as you all are with numbers, somebody not like us who are so deeply familiar would be like, I don't know what those are references to. But we've read the stories, and we know that Tavera and Kivrot Ta'ava are two of the places in Numbers 11, and Massa is actually a place from Exodus 17. And these are three places. These are just geographical references to stories from J about Israelites complaining in the wilderness. And while Moses is here, in the very next verse, he reminds us of the spies episode, right, where, similarly, the Israelites show a lack of faith and are punished. In other words, the stories that D refers to from J are all stories about how the Israelites disobeyed God. Again, look at the very next verse. As long as I have known you, you have been defiant toward the Lord. And this is really D's central historical concern. The people have been disobedient since they left Egypt. Know then that it is not for any virtue of yours that God's giving you this land to possess. You are stiff-necked. Never forget how you provoked God to anger in the wilderness. From the day that you left Egypt till you reached this place, you have continued defiant toward the Lord. It's a pretty good one. Cut away the thickening about your hearts. Stiffen your necks no more. To this day the Lord has not given you a mind to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. Well, I know how defiant and stiff-necked you are. Even now, while I am still alive in your midst, you have been defiant toward the Lord. Not only have the Israelites been disobedient, their actions have doomed Moses as well, he reminds us a number of times. Because of you, the Lord was incensed with me and said, you won't enter the land either. The Lord was wrathful with me on your account. The Lord was angry with me on your account. Right? Moses is very clear that everything is the Israelites' fault. Right? In the same breath that he's taking credit for stuff that he didn't really do, he's like, and you did everything wrong that you could have possibly done. It's a little self-aggrandizing. It's probably earned it at this point. D reminds the Israelites, for D, the laws are given here before the Israelites enter Canaan in order to give them a second chance. Right? They've been disobedient since they left Egypt up to this moment. Okay. I'm now giving you this lengthy law code. You've got another chance, right, to be obedient. A new covenant for living in a new land. But this time they have to actually obey the laws. And so D isn't just telling the Israelites how bad they've been. D reminds them incessantly that God had done all these great things for them, despite how bad they'd been. And exhorts the Israelites to remember them in a wide variety of ways. Take utmost care and watch yourselves so you don't forget the things you saw with your eyes and they don't fade from your mind. Right? The Lord took and brought you out of Egypt to be his very own people. Right? Has anything as grand as this ever happened or been ever been known? That God took a people out of another land? Right? When in time to come your children ask, what is with these laws? You tell them, we were slaves to Pharaoh and God took us out. It's not because you are numerous or impressive. You're small, but God was keeping a promise and rescued you. It's not because of your virtues and your rectitude, which is a word that no one should ever use, that you should be able to possess the country, right? It's because of their wickedness and because God made a promise. It's not for any virtue of yours. Your ancestors went down to Egypt, and God has made you numerous. You have seen all that the Lord did before your very eyes in the land of Egypt, the wondrous feats, etc. D could not be more emphatic about what God has done for Israel, despite them being non-virtuous and not having enough rectitude. Even the hardships that Israel experienced are explained as having been for their own good. Right? The whole wilderness period is seen as a pedagogical exercise, right? Training ground. Right? Remember, God made you travel in the wilderness that he might test you by hardships to learn what was in your hearts. Right? To teach you that man does not live on bread alone. A famous line. Right? Beware lest you forget God who freed you and led you, right? Who brought you and fed you. Ooh, that was nice. Right? In order to test you by hardships only to benefit you in the end. And there are regular reminders of the promise to the patriarchs. When the Lord your God enlarges your territory as he swore to your fathers, your ancestors, and gives you all the land that he promised to give to your ancestors, which is a kind of thing I chose one. This happens about 20 times in the book. Interesting side note about these references to the promise, as here, they only ever refer to the promise of land. The land I promised to give your fathers, to your ancestors. Why? Because we're standing at the border of Canaan, and the aspect of the promise that was you will become a great multitude of people, right? The promise of progeny, that was fulfilled forever ago, right? As I told you many moons ago now, right? The promise of progeny is fulfilled at the end of Genesis or the beginning of Exodus. From Exodus on, all we've cared about is the promise of land. Deuteronomy recognizes that, right? What's left to fulfill is the promise of land. And so once you get into the beginning of Exodus, every reference to the patriarchal promise is a reference to just the land. The other stuff's done. in sum, the entire history of Israel's experiences from Horeb to now in Deuteronomy is the history of the people's misbehavior and God's continued care for them. And this is, therefore, the motivation for the laws. And in the laws, as you saw when you read them, the people are also told regularly to remember their past. Bear in mind that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Therefore, I enjoin this commandment upon you today. Bear in mind that you were slaves in Egypt. Take care to obey these laws. Right. This, by the way, is what you asked of God, saying, let me not hear the voice anymore. Right? There, even again, what I'm trying to bring here is moments within the laws themselves, not in the narrative, not in the speeches that frame them, but in the laws that make reference to Israel's past. Right? The Lord your God who brought you from the land of Egypt is with you. The law about the Ammonites and the Moabites and who may be admitted is based on Israel's history, right? Because of the hiring of Balaam. Remember what God did to Miriam in reference to Numbers. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Again, therefore, I enjoin you to observe this commandment. Remember that you were a slave. Therefore, I enjoin you to observe this commandment. Remember what Amalek did to you. That's a reference to Exodus 17. And it all culminates with the historical sort of recollection of Deuteronomy 26, 5 through 9, right? The famous, my father was a fugitive or wandering or perishing, however you want to do that word, Aramean, who went down to Egypt. So we get the whole history, right? From Jacob to the descent into Egypt. And there he became a great and populous nation, right? That's the fulfillment of that aspect of the promise, is like right here, even in the summary. And then the enslavement and the crying out and the hearing of and the freeing and the signs and the wonders and the bringing us to this place being Canaan. Right? The history and the laws aren't separate. Right? The history and the laws work together. They're intertwined. The history explains the law giving, when it happened, but also why it happened and why Israel is obligated to the laws. And the laws themselves are tied back into the history. A remarkable feature of Deuteronomy, of D, is that even as the people are told to obey the laws and how to do so, they are also told very clearly that they are going to disobey them. There is an entire chapter about what's going to happen to the Israelites after they have suffered all of the curses. Right? Like, we get the laws, we get the chapter of blessings and curses, and then and then Moses says, okay, now look, after all the curses have befallen you, right, the curses for disobedience, here's what's going to happen then. Right? Which is the assumption that they're going to disobey. God tells Moses that the people will start disobeying after Moses' death. Right? You're going to die, and then the people go astray. They'll forsake me and break my covenant, and then I'm going to get angry at them. And God tells Moses to write down a poem that will be a witness against the Israelites in the future. Right? You're going to write it down now, and then, in time to come, when they disobey, whoever's in charge is going to pull it out and be like, I told you this was going to happen. So that, again, when they disobey, it will be clear that God knew beforehand. Right? When I bring them into the land, and they eat their fill and grow fat and turn to other gods and serve them and spurn me and break my covenant, and all these terrible things happen to them, this poem will confront them as a witness. Right? Because they're going to pass it down generation to generation. Because I know even now what they're planning on doing, even before I bring them into the land. And then Moses turns and essentially gives the same message to the people. I know how defiant and stiff-necked you are, even now while I'm still alive. How much more when I'm dead? Gather round, y'all, for I'm going to speak these words and call heaven and earth to witness against you. Right? When I'm dead, you're going to act wickedly, and misfortune will befall you. And then comes, of course, it's not an easy poem, but the poem in Deuteronomy 32, which sort of lays it all out. And, this little passage that I've just pulled out pretty much says it all. the rock, Yahweh, his deeds are perfect and ways are just, faithful, never false, true, upright. But its offspring, Israel, unworthy, crooked, perverse, base, false, dull, witless. Right? This is how you require. Right? This is how you pay back the God who is perfect and done so many wonderful things for you. This is how you pay him back. That's the poem. So again, law and history, both past and future, are intertwined and interrelated. As we have seen, Deuteronomy looks forward and is self-conscious about its legacy in a way that no other biblical text is. Right? Deuteronomy itself says, make this all known to the next generations. Right? Why? Because what you, right, the reason that you, Moses' audience, are likely or inclined to follow the law is you've seen stuff, right? You were there, right? You were in the wilderness. You saw God caring for you. You saw the wondrous things that God did. But your children didn't, and their children didn't. And so Deuteronomy is incredibly concerned with forgetting, right? They're going to get into the land. They're going to forget all the good things that God did, right? They're going to look around and be like, I just live here, right? This is normal. Forget that it's only because of God that they're there, right? It's not your children who experienced it, right? You saw all these marvelous deeds, so you have to teach them to your children. Future generations are responsible for upholding the law, right? It is for us and for our children ever to apply all the provisions of this Torah. And every 7th year, everyone is to hear the laws so that those who were not there will learn to obey. And probably not just hear the laws, but also hear the history that frames it, right? Not just hear a bunch of laws, but hear the rationale. You were slaves in Egypt. God did these wondrous things for you in the wilderness. Deuteronomy, in a way that no other text does, provides for its own promulgation. It is to be recited and written and transmitted and repeated and copied. And Deuteronomy, having, as we've seen, revised someone else's laws in its construction, is certain to make sure that it doesn't suffer the same fate. Right? Only this, don't add or remove anything. Right? As if it's a very self-aware moment, I think. Like the text, got here by editing someone else's work. I don't want that to happen to me. Okay, that was a little personal. Deuteronomy, plenty of time. Deuteronomy provides a framework for understanding the past, disobedience, punishment, and presents the future after the Israelites enter the land as a choice. The choice is blessing or curse. Blessing if you obey, curse if you do not obey. The choice is life or death. Obviously, when one of the choices is curse and death, it's not much of a choice, really. We need to remember that Deuteronomy, what Deuteronomy sets in the future, right? I put before you a choice. What Deuteronomy sets in the future is, for whoever is reading it or hearing it, the present. Right? Deuteronomy is a story about Israelites standing at the edge of the promised land, right? Being spoken to by Moses. That's who its audience is in the story. But the audience of the text itself is Israelites who are already in the land. When you enter the land, these will be the laws for you, really means you who are in the land, these are the laws for you. The choice is not one that their ancestors made, right? It's the choice of the people who are hearing it right now. And as Deuteronomy itself makes clear, it is intended for all future generations. I make this covenant not with you alone, but with those who are standing here today and those who are not here today. Every generation is supposed to read it and hear it, and so every generation gets to hear this text speaking to them. Everyone in every generation gets the choice. Right? The covenant may have been made by our ancestors, but we are renewing it. Right? We exist at all, Deuteronomy tells us, because God brought our ancestors out of Egypt, and we are therefore no less indebted than the first generation of the Exodus. The history is for and about us too, and the obligation, Deuteronomy tells us, is no less on us than on them. And so we are also faced with the option, obey or disobey. Right? We are the ones, Deuteronomy tells us, to whom God gave the most basic choice of all. I have put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life. All of this understanding of history, of choice, of reward and punishment, of obedience and disobedience will all come back again in great force in the second half of the semester as we read the rest of the biblical texts for this semester. This will become sort of an overarching theme that we'll talk about at length.